The message didn't hurt. What followed did. I was standing in the grocery store on 8th Street, one hand resting lightly on the cold metal of the cart, the other gripping my phone. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the aisles stacked with canned goods. The faint smell of stale bread mixed with the sharp tang of cleaning chemicals. My phone buzzed quietly against my palm. The screen showed a name I recognized, not a close friend, someone adjacent, someone who shouldn't have had an opinion yet. The text wasn't angry, it was careful, measured, like footsteps on thin ice. It asked if I was okay, said they'd heard things. I glanced at the reflection in the freezer glass, cool blue light softening my tired face, and understood all at once that a version of me was already moving through rooms I wasn't in, calmly, convincingly. And I wasn't the one telling that story. Her name was Maya. We'd been together for 3 years, long enough that people stopped asking questions and started filling in answers themselves. We lived in a mid-rise apartment near the city center. Nothing special, close enough to work, close enough to friends. The kind of place you don't photograph but don't complain about either. Our days follow a rhythm. Morning coffee, separate commutes, messages about errands, evenings that ended on the same section of the couch, the TV on low, conversations thinning as the hour grew late. We shared friends, group chats, birthdays, casual dinners where nothing important was said, and that was the point. From the act side, we looked functional, not affectionate, not distant, just steady enough to avoid scrutiny. People trusted that stability. They trusted it more than either of us. What was at stake wasn't whether we loved each other. That had already become secondary. What mattered was who would be believed once the narrative started moving without us in the same room. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was the way she answered a simple question. I asked when she'd be home. She paused, then gave me a full explanation instead of a time. She said she might stay late, said why, said who she was with. Details I hadn't asked for, delivered carefully like they needed to be placed in the right order. After that, there were small delays. A few seconds before replying to messages she usually answered without thinking. A habit of putting her phone face down when she sat beside me, then turning it back over once she forgot. Once I caught a look on her face when my name came up in conversation. Not irritation, calculation. Nothing there was alarming. Each moment could stand on its own and seem reasonable. I noticed all of it. I didn't react, not because I didn't care, because reacting would have clarified the boundaries she was still testing. Most people don't betray you loudly at first. They adjust their behavior just enough to see if you're paying attention.
Then came the adjustments. Her phone stopped lighting up when it was on the table between us. If it did vibrate, she'd turn it over without looking, like it was a reflex she'd practiced elsewhere. Conversations changed shape. I'd walk into a room and voices would soften, then trail off. Someone would ask an unrelated question to fill the gap. Plans shifted without explanation. Dinners moved, weekends shortened. She'd tell me after the fact, not before, as if the decision had already passed its point of discussion. The first time I heard it from someone else, it was casual. A friend, halfway through a drink, said she'd mentioned things were hard with me lately. I asked what she meant by that. They shrugged, then added, "She said you've been difficult." I asked who else she'd talked to. They paused before answering, long enough to say everything. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't just happening to me, it was being narrated. I didn't ask her about it, not because I was afraid, because questions would have warned her that I was paying attention. Instead, I listened. I watched how she spoke about us when other people were around. The words were careful, softened, framed to sound generous. She'd say things like she was trying to be patient, that she was working through things. There was a quiet weariness beneath her voice, like she was carrying a burden no one else saw. Each sentence placed effort on her side and friction on mine. Responsibility moved quietly, never assigned directly, just shifted, one phrase at a time, until it settled where she wanted it. If I disagreed with something, it became a mood. If I asked for clarity, it became pressure. If I stayed quiet, it became distance. The story always landed the same way. She was navigating something difficult, something that felt impossible to admit out loud. I was the difficulty. She wasn't hiding what she was doing. There was no secrecy in the structure of it. She was explaining it, preparing people to understand why whatever came next would make sense. There's a moment when anger would be easy. This wasn't it. The shift was quieter than that, almost administrative. I stopped correcting misunderstandings, stopped defending myself in conversations I wasn't part of, stopped explaining things I couldn't prove. I let the version of me she created exist without interference. I allowed it to take shape on its own. That decision wasn't emotional, it was practical. There was no need to argue against a story being told in rooms where I wasn't invited. No point trying to reclaim ground where the narrative had already shifted. It was easier to hold steady, to wait, to let the truth, or whatever passed for it, find its own way. Because some stories unravel quietly, only revealing their fractures to those patient enough to notice.
The truth surfaced without effort. A message was forwarded by mistake. A quiet click, barely audible over the low hum of voices in the background. It wasn't meant for me, but the screen lit up just the same. I saw a conversation I hadn't been part of, names repeated too often to ignore. A timeline began to unravel, dates slipping out of sync like a clock running slow. Stories overlapped in ways that made no sense when placed side by side, each discrepancy a faint echo in the stale air around me. I didn't chase these details. They came to me, carried on the soft rustle of notifications and whispered fragments of talk, because lies demand constant upkeep, and mistakes slip through in moments like these, unseen but felt. When I finally pieced it all together, the cold certainty settled like a weight in my chest. She hadn't just cheated, she had prepared the environment first, quietly, methodically. The version of events she built was designed to protect her and to isolate me. I didn't expose her. I didn't need to. Stories change shape on their own. People notice when details no longer align, when explanations arrive too late to be convincing, when someone continually revises the past, molding it like soft clay to fit their version of events. Friends began asking quieter questions, not directly confronting me, but their curiosity was persistent. Casual remarks slipped in during conversations, comments with an edge that hinted at doubt. The atmosphere at work shifted. Colleagues grew more distant, their greetings shorter, their interactions less frequent. Conversations stopped just short of acknowledgement, as if everyone was waiting for something unsaid. Support from people I counted on thinned, not with a confrontation or open disagreement, but through absence. Invitations stopped coming, messages went unanswered. The subtle withdrawal was more effective than any argument could have been. I stayed where I was, consistent, predictable, even boring in contrast. That quiet steadiness did the work. It required no force, no need for argument or proof, just presence. The difference between who I was and the version she created became clearer in those silences, and sometimes that alone is enough to shift the story. Eventually, someone asked me directly what happened. I gave them the truth, plain and simple, just once. I didn't add any extra detail or spin, no emotion, no justifications, no appeals. I didn't seek their agreement or understanding. There was no need. By that point, the story had already taken on a life of its own. It no longer depended on me to be believed or doubted. Reputations don't fall apart with loud declarations or dramatic confrontations. They unravel quietly, piece by piece. The damage happens in the small silences, the moments when people stop defending what they once accepted. It grows in the gaps between conversations, in the subtle shifts of tone and attention. I observed it without interference, without rushing to explain or defend, because as certainty faded,
the need to convince others diminished as well. Truth doesn't always require a spotlight. Sometimes it simply waits patiently in the background until it becomes impossible to ignore. She told everyone I was the problem. What surprised her wasn't losing me, it was losing control of the story once I stopped participating. When I withdrew, the narrative no longer bent to her will. The version of me she created began to unravel quietly, on its own. Sometimes the most powerful silence is the one that refuses to engage.